Sure. Okay, so currently I've been a postdoc at UC Davis for I'm in my fifth year. My first 4 years was with a group called APHIS, which is AI for Next Generation Food Systems, and it is an NSF-funded research institute. While I was there, I was building an AI ethics framework with them. I interviewed the researchers that were working on AI technologies, as well as many of the stakeholders in the food system. And that gave me a lot of on the ground perspective. I might share a couple of the articles that we produced from that research. And now I am a postdoc with the Department of Public Health Sciences in UC Davis Health, which is the School of Medicine, basically. And then I'm also a lecturer in Science and Technology Studies here at Davis. So I both am a researcher as well as a lecturer, and I have a sort of split role. So
Amazing. And just to introduce myself, my name is Ellen Coughlin. I'm a program manager at the Health Foundation, which is a UK-based think tank, do tank. We do a bit of charitable funding, we do a bit of policy influencing and research, and I've been working across kind of AI tech and data analytics, really trying to get the NHS to do a bit more with data. And the sort of format of these downloads is that our host, Carrie, will give us a presentation about the work that she's doing, and then we'll all have the opportunity to ask some questions. You can feel free to ask some questions in the chat, but also if you'd like to turn your camera on and join a kind of more interactive discussion, you are more than welcome. So I will turn over to Carrie now, and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as well. Carrie, would you like to take it away?
sure, that's great. And I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see, this will go. There you are. All right, can everyone see this? Is this looking good? Hopefully. All right. And then, of course, this is my email address. I just want to point that out. Please feel free to email me now, after, whenever. I would love to get in touch with everyone attending. And I'm always looking for ways to collaborate, build relationships, etc. All right, so I already mentioned kind of what I do, but I want to just say, so I've been exploring concepts of games and gamification as governance methods, and in fact, right now I'm in my AI and Society course that I'm teaching currently, and for the last year or two, I've been working with students, and we are actually building a game about AI, which is a little different. It's not. It's really about looking at AI in social and political and cultural contexts, legal contexts. So we are working on literally building a game, and I run simulation games in my classes and courses. And in fact, some of the things we're working on, I have my website on there. You can go to that lab page, and I have some of the current projects we've been working on. We're exploring these in they're getting credit for this. But it may get funded. We'll see. I don't know. But that is something that we're exploring in a very literal sense. But some of the underlying work is what I'm going to share today. So I'll go ahead and advance. When I came on board with APHIS, which was the organization I mentioned I was a postdoc with for the last several years, I was starting to work with a person named Mark Yarborough. He is recently retired, but he was the bioethicist for UC Davis School of Medicine for a number of years. And in his work, he was reaching out to other industries. In fact, they held a focus group. They were working to try to understand how other industries governed themselves and had learned from their failures and from successes, to try to import that knowledge into bioethics and the in medical practice and health practice, to sort of, as I would put it, expedite the learning curve on managing and governing themselves. Um, that research became the foundation for the research that he and I and another of our colleagues were doing within APHIS. So we were attempting to also borrow from bioethics and other industries and bring that information into the governance of AI. And that's somewhat significant. It means that we started from a very different place than maybe a lot of the more theoretical work on AI ethics. Um, This is the first article that I'm listing here. I'm just giving you some of the background. That is an article that he had published with his colleagues, the culture, moving from the culture of compliance to a culture of trustworthiness. Of course, we know a lot. There's a lot about trust and AI, et cetera, but, and I won't get into all of that, but we started really from a standpoint of failure, like what wasn't working. And it turned out in his research, he was discovering through the people that he interacted with and spoke with and interviewed that compliance was not enough. And so while we do have a lot of frameworks and checklists and even wonderful things that are being put forward as legislation, et cetera, that doesn't mean that it would be enough to actually safely govern some of the technologies, whether that be AI or what we might call AI. There are many technologies that get grouped with that, but also even technologies outside of AI. It may not be enough to just rely on a sort of checklist and compliance-based approach. So we began from there, and by interviewing people who were stakeholders, as I mentioned, I was really getting that very on the ground look at what it means to try to implement frameworks, implement laws, how to try to work within sometimes conflicting legal and ethical guidelines, um, with limited resources and all sorts of challenges that they were facing. And that has been what has informed my work. And we've encountered some somewhat surprising, um, I guess, surprising findings. And these are some of the articles that we've written. Um, all right, so in a nutshell, I would say there are three approaches to governing AI, or perhaps most technologies or other things. We can use soft law mechanisms that are managed internally. And I won't get into, I'm not going to read the slides, but you can look at these. One of the common criticisms of this, and you've probably encountered this, is that soft law frameworks, which are, voluntary, they are not compulsory, and often have no consequences, are usually framed as toothless or useless by those who critique them. Now, some would say they're very useful, and sometimes a combination of things can be very useful, but that is one of the common critiques, that if you don't follow this framework, nothing really happens. And so then you can look at, usually then it is argued that we should move to hard law or passing new regulations, or we maybe should make better use of the laws and regulations that we already have. Um, so those are just some broad groupings of different positions that often people have been taking. Obviously, there could be other options, and there could be combinations of these approaches, but these are some of the broad areas that people mention when they're talking about governing AI. But I just like to note that in those cases, all of those usually depend on certain methods for tracking performance, right? So you will have risk assessments, reporting, compliance programs, measuring or attempting to measure potential harms, auditing, requirements for disclosure, informed consent, et cetera. Um, I'm sure we've all seen those, but all of those also rest on a single assumption, which is that we need to see more of the decisions and actions people are making in order to govern and to determine whether or not they've complied with laws or with frameworks. Um, the problem with that is, can we? Can we actually see more? Um, Problems for increasing our ability to see would be if we wanted to implement, say, a framework even, or something that is that requires tracking to determine whether we've met the standards or not. It usually requires budgets, large budgets. And in my experience and in what I have been hearing from many people that I've interviewed, and where I see this everywhere, is that budgets are usually very limited, and it is very difficult to get organizations to start adopting the necessary resources, including staffing and other types of budgetary items that they would need in order to track or monitor performance and to determine whether they're meeting the standards that they have set. Um, and then corporate structures or corporate cultures often resist this. We can probably imagine why, but if there are other priorities for the resources that they have, or the culture is one in which the norm has not been to track all of these different elements of their work, their performance, or maybe they think they don't need it, etc. Those can also be barriers to moving forward with monitoring or tracking or seeing what is going on in an organization. Other things such as just increasing reporting may not necessarily mean that we know more. So this point has been made by scholars who note that just a barrage of data does not necessarily move you further toward understanding what is happening. Sometimes that can certainly help. And it's not to say don't collect the data or don't have standards and reports, et cetera, but it might also not end up being that it tells us what we were hoping it would tell us. Another point that has been made is that even when reports are generated, even if they're mandatory, whether they're mandatory or voluntary, there isn't necessarily a sufficient incentive, at least, to read those reports. And that also takes a huge amount of um, financial resourcing, et cetera, to then begin to comb through all of the data that you have received. Um, so again, just having reports does not necessarily mean that it will tell us more. Other issues that people have noted are things like regulatory arbitrage, where everyone will say move to an area that is less regulated so that they can sort of avoid or dodge the requirements being placed on them for reporting, et cetera. Or even sometimes we have ethical safeguards that are, in a sense, I would say distorted and then ended up being used or even co-opted to serve other ends. Things like in the U.S., First Amendment rights and data privacy, et cetera, can be used to further ends that are not necessarily about what is best for users or the public. So these are just a few examples that I can point to that where it isn't necessarily easy to increase or step up the visibility we have on the decisions and the actions that are going on within an organization. So say they are an organization that develops AI, or maybe they're one that simply adopts and deploys an AI technology that was developed by some other firm. Their actual uses of that, the decisions they make regarding it, aren't necessarily something we can track or see. So if that's the case, then we would have an issue. So I have what I'm calling a sort of ideal of law. So we can see we might build political will toward passing the law, we make the law, we implement the law. Then it comes to enforcing it, and ideally, even with revisions, et cetera, we would achieve something around accountability or justice, or something we might call that. But what I have seen, or what I'm arguing, is that we run into a real problem with enforcing laws. It is one thing to pass law, and it is another thing to have enough information that you can use to then actually enforce it, especially when strategies are in play that maybe end up becoming barriers to the tracking and monitoring necessary to enforce the law. So if we can't track it and we can't enforce it, then maybe we can't achieve accountability or something we might think of as justice in these systems. Again, so more strategies for evading visibility. We had encountered ones where we would say complicating causality, meaning it's difficult to prove that someone has done something wrong when they have taken steps to make sure that it is impossible to know that that proof exists. Things like preventing paper trails, or in the case of the research we did, in the interviews I did, simply not adopting an algorithm that they know works so that they can avoid having any proof that they knew ahead of time, can mean that they would then not be held liable down the road if a harm does occur, which is almost the opposite of what we normally hear, is that if you just build technologies more so that they're more effective and that they work and everyone trusts them, everyone will adopt. But we found that at least in cases that it might benefit the public, it wouldn't be adopted. There's judgment proofing, which is another. I can go into more definitions if anyone would like to know. Risk shifting, using compliance programs and shifting the risks of liability from an organization onto their employees or onto others. Disclosures and consent for that same purpose, and then strategic litigation. All of these are methods for that really defeat or attempt to defeat the enforcement of regulations and laws. So what can we do? We can continue, of course, working to understand these problems, working to move forward with all of the approaches that I began with. I mean, I'm not arguing that this is sort of an either or proposition that we should only have one sort of legal approach or another, right? Really, all of them would, I'm sure, be best used in complement with one another. Um, but then also what I'm doing is working on approaches that help either increase incentives for reading reports or maybe bypass that need for visibility as much as possible, and use very different methods. So that's the research that I've been doing. Um, okay, so this is the sort of setup. I almost want to pause and see if we have any. That's a lot to go through in a very short time, so I apologize if it's. But moving forward, I will simply say, um, thinking of this as a game, I find very useful, because it does seem that what we have is groups of people who may want to see more governance and stepping up accountability and understanding what is going on in systems. And then other groups or individuals who would like to undermine that. And it's hard to have these conversations without casting anyone in particular in a negative light. Um, but if I think of this as a game and just think of this as different strategies in play and how various individuals may implement this, that is something that I have found very useful as a framework. So the next set of slides, just to warn you, will be a series of sort of graphics, where I can try to demonstrate what I think is sort of the core problem or why it becomes a game. Um, so I don't know if anyone would be familiar with the notion of the pacing problem in technology. This is the notion that law tends to lag behind technology. So I'm actually capturing this. This was in a different journal. I'm using this and then I'm adapting this to demonstrate a different point. The complexity is where, if as technology becomes more complex, um, the law may not be complex enough to keep up with it. This is the theory of the pacing problem. Um, Law itself can become more complex, and if we think of complexity as the thing that helps adapt when, as say, a technology begins doing things that we weren't expecting and that our laws were not built to handle, in theory, then the law becoming more complex would be a good thing potentially, because it would mean that it was keeping pace or beginning to catch up to technologies. And there are many who argue that there are some who would argue that there is no pacing problem, that we have sufficient law already made, that if we just leverage that in a better way or a more effective way, we would have all the law we really need to keep up with the AI technologies we're seeing. I think that I think we should leverage those laws better, but that doesn't mean that I don't think we would also need to acknowledge that many of the laws we have and much of what we have done in our legal system is not necessarily adequate to keep up with what AI is capable of and what AI is doing, especially within, again, human and social contexts. How humans are able to use AI changes how they're able to conduct themselves in and around legal frameworks, um, meaning I think they can evade. So I would argue to some degree there is a pacing problem. I think we do not have all the laws and all of the methods and all of the understanding that we might need in order to handle this. But that isn't the notion of law keeping up with technology. But I would argue then that there is another piece to this. Um, there is the knowledge of the law, which tends to continue to grow. Now, it might ebb and flow. So I could make this line very wiggly, up and down and up and down, and it could vary from moment to moment. But over time, knowledge of law tends to increase because everyone is trying to learn as much as they can about the law. In fact, firms are particularly incentivized to know everything they possibly can about the law so that they can know how to leverage it on their own behalf. So that is an incentive that I would say states find difficult to keep up with because it takes a lot of public dollars to then have governance in place that could match or equal the kinds of maybe profit incentives that come from knowing how to get um, to set up your business or conduct your business in a way that um, takes the best possible advantage of legal standards and frameworks, whether that be through in the case of lawsuits or avoiding lawsuits or um, leveraging regulations or et cetera, right? Like learning more about the law puts them more and more ahead. So even if there are periods of uncertainty about how it may apply to a particular case, there are entire professions whose job it is to only learn more about that so that they can advise firms and individuals on how to leverage it. However, knowledge of compliance, I believe, continues to go down uh, because, especially as things become more complex, it ends up becoming harder to track performance. And even though it might be that we would think it would make it easier, I would argue whether it's getting more, the law is getting more complex or not, tracking compliance with laws and regulations would become, or frameworks, whatever it is you're following, standards, would be difficult um, in when you're contending with others whose very strong incentive is to leverage the law as best as they can. So those 2 points are always working against one another. And what we have here is a system where some may be able to outrun the law because they can't be seen and they are able to evade visibility and evade therefore all of the compliance and accountability that comes with that. So I have overlaid these onto one another just so that we can see what that kind of looks like. We could put these lines in different places. As I said, we could make them go up and down, but over time, I believe that even if law does gradually keep up with the technology, the knowledge of the law and the tech will continue to increase and the knowledge of the compliance will go down. Um, but this is a sort of weird graphic. And I've worked, my PI with APHIS was an ag economist, and we've worked together on a different way of graphing this. So I'm going to show you that in case that is easier, because I'm not sure what is easiest for everyone to sort of visualize or understand. But just to put it in a different way, essentially, as complexities of the law and technology um, increase, the knowledge of the technology and of law also would increase over time. I'm showing that at first it may decrease because there is a period of uncertainty. There is a period of, oh, we have something new and we're not quite sure which laws apply or how the law applies to this or what we're going to do. But over time, um, that uncertainty would begin to diminish because there are people who are constantly working to try to diminish that uncertainty and very intentionally, and so their knowledge of the law would increase. Likewise, something like this might happen. We might initially develop a more complex law that keeps up with the newer technologies, and we might see even maybe an uptick in our ability to track. But I believe over time, it will actually fall. Um, and this is again because the knowledge of law is increasing. So as the knowledge of law and how to leverage it increases, knowledge of compliance would potentially go down because it would be difficult to keep up with the amount of knowledge of law that's accumulating. I'm noting that there might be a period of uncertainty, and I would say that is where we've been for the last few years regarding AI. AI technologies are right now creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty within the law um, and legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lack of consensus. People are waiting to find out how courts will rule. There isn't enough case precedent that has accumulated. So a lot of this is speculation and attempting to try to anticipate what courts will rule and what laws will get passed. And then, of course, lobbying for certain kinds of laws or against them. But so we are in a period of uncertainty. That is where I would place us now. But I think over time, we see that the knowledge of law will eventually begin to increase again, and our ability to track may decrease. Um, and then, so then this is again just two quick other graphs to sort of show what we would like. In a in an ideal case, we would build more complex law to keep up with the more complex technologies, and this would decrease that gap. So if we think about the gaps here, we can see knowledge of law going up, knowledge of compliance going down. This forms a gap in those types of knowledge. So the knowledge gap ideally would go down as we build more law to keep up with technology. But I think what we actually have is, whether or not we're building more complex laws or not, our knowledge gap will continue to remain or even increase over time, because the law of knowledge is going to increase or even outstrip or outpace our ability to track it. And not just our capacity, but technologically, but also our will, political will, passing the laws, making it feasible, putting resources toward that. All of those create barriers to monitoring performance and vis-a-vis the standards. And so it's simply, when we think about who is incentivized to do what, when there are very strong incentives to, again, learn about the law, whether it's new or old law, but learn about the law, leverage it, and use it to your advantage. And then it takes a much stronger effort and a lot of expense to try to monitor that, to monitor people's performance, even if law is passed. So that is essentially where I think we are at. I know this again was a lot of a breeze through, and I hope this wasn't too much to go through in whatever few minutes. And of course, I really would like to talk about this with all of you. I'd be very eager to hear any thoughts you have. Yeah, so that is basically everything I had to share.